Hi, Susie.
Yeah. And so today, yeah, we're going to do what we did yesterday and spend some time sort of sharing frameworks and then go back into small groups just to allow people to connect with where they are, but also explore some of those frameworks together. We'll do that in about an hour's time and then leave the last half hour for Q&A for anyone who has questions or stories that they want to share. So Morley, maybe in a moment, I'll just turn to you. Part of what we've begun as a practice on these calls, just to help practice and model for our lives, is how to find grounding, and how to find grounding in community, grounding in ideas, grounding in our bodies, grounding in our emotions. And so I've asked my dear friend Morley to again join us and help us do that. She has a way of grounding me with her voice and energy and wisdom. Morley's an artist, activist, bridge builder, just a good friend. So Morley, maybe I'll turn it over to you and ask you to help ground us, and then we'll continue. So thank you, Morley, for joining us again. I think you're on mute, Morley, and we do want to hear you.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. I think it would be nice to just do about a little under 5 minutes of mindful breathing. So let's come to the edge of the seat, edge of your chair. You can hear me okay? And have your feet very relaxed on the floor. You know, if you want to sit cross-legged or you're lying down, doesn't matter. As long as you're feeling that there's space for your abdomen to expand comfortably. And then let's place the right hand on the belly and then the left hand on the heart or in the center of the chest. And let's roll the shoulders all the way up and back and down and slightly lean back and bring your chin in just a little bit. So what's happening now is you've just lengthened your spine and you feel the head going all the way up towards the sky and the base of your spine sinking down into the root system of the earth. So you feel that oppositional pull and creating spaciousness in the spine. And let your feet relax down into that root system as well. You can bring your eyes closed or open just enough to let the light in. Relaxing the eyes, relaxing the jaw, relaxing the tongue, and relaxing the throat. And I'll do a very slow, simple inhalation and exhalation on 6 counts. Don't worry if it's too slow or too fast for you. You can breathe at your own rhythm. The most important thing is we're breathing together in this circle. And we're supporting each other. We are with each other. We are together. So exhale all the way, all the breath out through the nose. And then gently inhale through the nose, feeling the abdomen rise. And continue to inhale and feel the chest expand. Beautiful. Exhale, feel the belly soften. And then the ribs and chest soften. Inhale, feel the belly rise. Chest expands. Exhale, belly softens. Heart and chest soften. All through the nose if you can. Inhale. Exhale, shoulders are water. Beautiful. Inhale, belly rises. Chest expands. Exhale, belly softens. Heart softens. Inhale, belly expands. Chest expands, back expands. Feel the in the back. Exhale, soft belly, soft heart. Shoulders are water. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale, breath of life. Exhale, breath of life. Inhale, abdomen rises, ribs and chest expand. Exhale, soft belly, soft heart. And continue this way for about 4 more breaths. Feel the warmth of your hands. Let's take one more collective breath together. Feeling the power of our togetherness. Exhale. And wiggle your fingers and toes and gently bring your eyes open, slowly. Have a beautiful day. Thank you, Zander. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Morley. Thank you, helping us ground in ourselves and find grounding for all of us and the work in front of us. So appreciate you. Thank you. So we're going to continue today with sort of a new set of ideas and continue sort of exploring tools and practices that help us walk through these times. Part of what we're looking for is how do we metabolize and process what's happening to us and what's in front of us. And so I'm gonna, again, share some ideas and share some tools for that. I wanted to just acknowledge that some of you were here yesterday, some are new today. We'll do a little bit of framing in the beginning. I walked over here from my house to the retreat space that we built. It's about 10 blocks. And in the 10 blocks that I walked, I passed 4 people in New York City, which just is amazing what is happening and the sacrifice. And I actually don't like the phrase, the new normal, because I'm not sure I want to normalize this. I did walk with my mask and with the mustache that my children put on my mask. And I walked with a little radio player that was playing MC Hammer, Can't Touch This. Because what's happening in New York is people are walking by each other and not smiling. And I miss the smiles and I miss those other pieces. Part of what we talked about yesterday in the adaptive frame was how do we invent the new and let go of the past? And what's happening in New York and other places are people are spending a lot of time, I think, cleaning out their closets more than cleaning out some of their feelings. And I was hilariously found this, that someone is throwing out the past and literally throwing out what is one version of what was happening. And it just kind of made me laugh in the face of what we're going through. So part of what we're going to do today is share some very different content than we shared yesterday. And this is really a skill set in scenario planning. And part of why we're doing this is to help people understand what is the choices that are coming in front of them and what might they need to be ready for. And so I want to again spend some time laying out a framework and ask you, it might be helpful to have pen and paper out, but ask you to think about where do you want to apply this? Because sometimes we talk about these moments as existential moments of what does it mean to be alive? But we also realize it's about very real decision making, and that many of us have decisions about what we have to do with our lives, our companies, our families. And so scenario planning is a method for doing that. And so I want to sort of take us through a process for looking at scenario planning, one that you can apply to yourself, to your work, to your lives, to the companies, to the consultants, you know, for those you are working with. Again, we're in this evolution series. Today is on scenario planning. We're doing it every day. Before we get into that, I just want to do a few sort of gentle reminders. The first reminder is that we're all going through a collective and adaptive experience. And we're all walking into territory that we haven't been in before. All of us are not fully prepared for this. That's the nature of evolving into new spaces and work. And part of what we want to do as we walk into this, hopefully honoring that each of us has to process this differently, is to kind of move from crisis to thinking about this as chapters. One of the things that we know in a crisis frame, in a crisis history, is that most of us in crisis, when things get more complex and harder, we kind of fall to our defaults. We actually default to control mechanisms and sometimes the patriarchy and systems that existed before. So what we want to do in part is begin to stretch the timeline out, to understand we're going to be doing this for a while, to understand that we want to equip ourselves for what's coming, and whenever we can, move from some of that crisis phase into the next chapter of the work. And then the last gentle reminder that we shared yesterday is that being an adult or adulting is not suffering privately. It's about metabolizing and digesting what's happening. And it's about getting the help you need and care for yourself and care for others. And just thank you to the notes that people sent after yesterday, asking for the care they needed, but also pointing to those who also need some more care. What we'll do at the end of this is also point to some organizations that are helping people without a safety net, because clearly by default of us being part of this, we have some safety net. So again, just a little bit of a reminder that in these adaptive times, that there are no kind of existing solutions. We're going to have to invent some of them, that this work and time lands differently on each of us, differently because of our history, differently because of our makeup, differently because of our internal systems and life, differently of where we have privilege, where we have the freedom to focus and play and discover where we need to survive. And that part of this process is giving up what was and forming what will be. But as we keep doing these sessions, part of what we're hoping to realize is that this adaptive work is muscle building. It is equipping ourselves for the challenges of today and what's coming. And that's clearly what our hope is for these sessions and for you to do in support of each other. The last thing that we want to share from yesterday is just that we're all kind of in this sort of sense-making climb of what to do with our companies, what to do with ourselves, what to do with our inner lives and our spirit, the parts of us that want to have control and the parts of us that need some faith. And so just asking and reflecting on where are you in this process? And hopefully today is a very significant tool in the decision-making process of how do we create meaning in those things. And so that's what we're gonna kind of walk through together as we do this. Scenario Planning Tuesday, here we go. So again, part of what we're doing in scenario planning is trying to do two things simultaneously. It's trying to help us figure out what could happen and how do we get prepared for those different futures. And secondarily, how do we create what happens? There's a way in which we don't want to be, the language I often use is accidental tourists in life, where all we're trying to do is bump into what happens to us, but we want to be able to curate what's happening with more effectiveness. Now, we would be naive to say that you can walk through life curating everything that happens to you, and it lands kind of somewhere in the middle, somewhere between reacting to what life throws at us and then sort of simultaneously helping us sort of figure out what we want to have happen. And so we think about this as how do we become more future ready? And again, we're doing this session knowing some of us are just still in survival mode, and we just have a little bit of attention span that we can give to this. Part of what happens when we start to think about what the world can be and what scenarios are is people generally hold on to what was. What we find is people have so much clingingness. They long for and hold on to what was, and they have a difficult time imagining what can be. And so we're going to walk you through some ideas and tools that would help you do that. The other thing that we're quite good at is catastrophizing, right? This idea that in our mind, we can come up with the most fear-based scenario, and we could talk about why society and media helps us do that. But certainly what we want to figure out is what is the expanse of what's possible not but just what was, but not just the worst case scenario that our minds go to. The kind of work here is trying to figure out what could be on one end, but also in a very real way, what we want it to be. And we'll talk more about how that looks like. Part of this work is really sometimes challenging because it's asking us to operate between realism and optimism. It's asking us to look very clearly at what could be happening. And all of us in many ways are trying to figure out what could be happening now. I am sitting in New York at one of the epicenters of this illness, and I have spent many hours trying to figure out what it could be and what it could look like. There's a huge part of me in my own scenario planning that wants to look to Europe and Asia for those models. What I also know is I don't think those models are sufficient. If you look at the average health standards of a 40-year-old man in Europe, and you look at the average health standards of what a 40-year-old person is in America, they're quite different. And so the myths that have come into my narrative and our narrative that this is an elder disease, it's for those who have specific health increments and ailments, doesn't necessarily I think that will apply. I think we're going to see a lot more younger deaths and distributed, unevenly distributed sort of challenges in reality on many populations. What this will mean for poor communities, African-American communities in the United States and other places is very devastating. And we want to look with realistic eyes to that as much as we want to look for pattern recognition. We also want to look optimistically at what could be. We want to look optimistically at what things could happen. Optimism to me is not naive daydreaming. It's trying to think about, from the ingredients we have now, what is possible? What is the adjacent possible thing that we have? And so that's what we're trying to look at, and trying to have our feet on the ground, and grounding from morally or practices or meditation will help us understand that expanse between what is realistically happening and what could optimistically happen. Optimistically, what could happen from the ingredients we have. I want to give a little bit of a history of where scenario planning came from. And many people are sometimes surprised that it came from, in my understanding, Shell Oil. And what Shell Oil Company was doing was looking at, had an incredibly smart, very well-paid strategy team. And that strategy team would develop these 5-year plans of what should we be doing. And then as they were doing those 5-year plans, all this other stuff would happen in the world. And they realized that that plan was then thrown out and they weren't prepared for the rest of the world. And so rather than having one plan, what they started to do was develop scenarios of how the world could be, what could happen in the world. Scenarios of what would happen with oil prices, what would happen in Nigeria, what would happen to wind farms and other sources of electricity. They had 50-year scenarios, 3-year scenarios. But what they started to do from the scenario process was actually prepare themselves and equip themselves more for the future. And so it was a technology or methodology that came from there. And then, as some may know, famously, Nelson Mandela used it when he came out of jail into the presidency and looked at all of these different scenarios about what could happen with race relations, with the economy, with South African leadership. Nelson Mandela used it to do that, and famously in his speech talked about the Icarus scenario, where he didn't want to, on sort of a moral platform, ignore some of the economic and other realities and fly too close to the sun. So just to understand, there's social applications and business applications within this methodology. I'm delighted that there are also artists on this call who hopefully can bring it to the art and the delivery of the art in the world, but there's lots of different applications to this. And part of what I want to walk you through is a methodology so you can think about it for yourself, but also you, the loved ones. Because if we're caught simply in the what was and catastrophizing, we don't have the creative energy or the realistic view of what is possible. And so that's what this methodology is intended to sort of provide. As we kind of walk into it, the thing that's very clear to me, having done this with companies and movements and activists, is that generally neither one of these two scenarios happen. We don't get what was, and we don't get the worst case scenario of what our mind can go to. We start sometimes with this question of what do we believe from the world we just left will still be here? What portion, what practices, what norms, what institutions will be here? And so that's what we want to start to think about together. Part of this process is beginning to use our imagination, our strategy, our self-care to begin to generate plausible scenarios. I'll give you some tools in a second of how to do that. The idea here is, can we generate multiple scenarios of what will be? And as you can think about applying this to yourself, you can think about it to your business. You can think about it to what is this COVID crisis going to mean? You can think about it to our economy. You can think about it to the narrative qualities of how we're going to understand this moment. How is this a moment of social activism, of inequality, of all of those things? What are scenarios of how we're going to think and understand this work? And so that's partly what we're trying to figure out. I only am using in this diagram 4 scenarios, but there's no magic or logic to that. We don't want to have 1,000 because we want to be able to look at them, but we do want to figure out what those different scenarios can be. As we start to try and imagine what scenarios lie in front of us for our work, philanthropy, art, our families, there's lots of ways to do this. We may do another workshop just to help people with this. We do something called the orthodoxy game or the rules game, where we try and look at what are all the rules that we've been living by, the orthodoxies that are sometimes conscious or unconscious, and which ones of those are true now, which do we want to affirm, which do we want to let go of. A different way to understand it, though, is there's lots of factors that dictate what scenarios are possible or that you should be considering or preparing yourself for. We can imagine simultaneously that we're going to face a world that has high innovation and creativity, or one where there's low innovation and stagnation. You can imagine that we're moving to a place where companies and individuals are willing to take high risk and companies want to invest in the future, or where there's risk mitigation. I can't tell you how many CEOs I've talked to in the last week that are spending all of their time on risk mitigation, which is so far from actual imagination of what else is possible. We can think about high probability, low probability outcomes. You know, it's interesting to think about who thought COVID was a high probability versus a low probability. You know, the question here is, are we in this new world going to have a series of old pressures or new pressures? How do we begin to understand and examine what those might be on how we live our lives, how we congregate, how we do our business? Many people use this term, sort of the VUCA world, you know, that we're going to live in a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguous world versus one that's more stable. You know, there's a very real way in which I think if we don't learn the lessons of COVID and figure out how to build more stability, equilibrium, we're going to continue to live in a VUCA world until we learn those lessons. Part of what we're seeing now is where are all the empty spots or the places of need of where we are. You know, I know my children are spending all this time reading media and arts at night, and all of the artists who made those are now unemployed. I know the spaces that exist that which we want to bring intelligence. We can think about that. Where is our world going to be fragmented? Where is it going to be more consolidated? What will be more inclusive versus exclusive? One of the things, the popular growing beliefs, is that we are going to slowly emerge from our isolation into pods of people and safety, pods of people who have held practice and trust with each other. What does that mean for inequality or seclusion or supply chains in those pieces? Where do we think we're entering a world where there's high available capital and resources or low? Where is there going to be high social order or low social order? For many of us, we've come from cities and communities that had low unemployment and low crime. Is that a scenario we think is going to continue? How do we begin to look at those different scenarios becomes important. Similarly, high consumer spending, low consumer spending. There's a beautiful idea out there that we're moving from consumerism to citizenship. That seems wonderful and overly simplistic. It seems to me we're moving from lack of health to greater health. Again, overly simplistic. In some ways, the eating habits and health is changing dramatically, right? So again, just trying to help you think about what are the scenarios that are worth thinking about, just to be ready for some, but also to prepare for and be deliberate in others. And that's kind of the process. And so we'll spend a little more time in our small groups talking about some of these scenarios. And we can walk you through other tools, but you can imagine coming out of this, we can begin to imagine 4 or 5 different scenarios of what could happen. And again, our experiences when we're facing adaptation and change, disciplined attention is quite helpful. Disciplined attention to what could be and how do we prepare ourselves is important. That's the way we get future ready and strategic in what's happening. So the first act that we do is try and land on these different scenarios. We try and look at what is possible. In philanthropy, there's a huge move to be more open with giving and more sort of open dollars and more general operating. Many of us who work and support philanthropists thinks that's exactly the right first move. And then we anticipate there's a second move where people are going to get more strategic and more restrictive. How do we understand the landscape that these things are happening in? How much of this move to turn everything digital is the right move? How much consumer demand is there going to be for those things? For the consultants out there who are trying to figure out how to engage work, what is the different scenarios of what their work will look like? Part of the way we understand the scenarios right now is we're all earning the right to be in relationship with each other afterwards. For those of us who have, and many people on the call who are trusted advisors, people are coming to us. There's a quality of that relationship that's quite different than being a service provider where we're known and have the agreement to provide a smaller set of things. How do we move from service to more trusted relationships? What are those different scenarios? So one of the homework assignments or things we can explore in a small group are what are some of those different scenarios? And often it's helpful to name the scenarios so they have some catchiness so we can know what we're referring to. But identifying those scenarios is only the first step. The second step, once we have those scenarios identified, is having to ask the question of what is the likelihood that these might happen? If we just continued and sort of walked the path, what is the likelihood for each one of these scenarios? Do we think it's very certain, uncertain, which are not? And that's an important sort of thing to keep bringing our intelligence to. Part of what we're learning in this process is the time frame with which this is going to land on us is extending and extending. As a parent, I first heard that my children weren't going to go back to school for 2 weeks. Then it was 6 weeks. Now it's the end of this entire school year and they're beginning to question whether they'll go back in 2020 at all. When will we go back to consumer behavior? When will we go back to those things? And so this question of how likely are each of these scenarios going to happen is iteratively informed. So I would keep watching, how do we understand the likelihood of these scenarios? The next thing that we want to think about, though, once we've started to place and understand the likelihood of each of these, is kind of how prepared are we? How prepared are we to exist in the world where this scenario is true? In a very simple way, in America, our sort of stoplights are red, yellow, green, stop, not red at all, green, obviously good to go, yellow somewhere in the middle. But it'd be really helpful to understand how prepared are you as a family, as a business, as a partner, as a friend, to face the scenarios with which that are coming. Obviously, I'm just giving a basic framework now, and the work we do with people and teams is much more detailed than how prepared people are. But the second question we want to ask is how prepared are we for each one of these different scenarios? And there's different consequence for them. We're matching then the likelihood with our preparedness, and this is obviously a iterative, ever-evolving dynamic model. But then what we want to ask is the third level. If we've identified them, how likely they are, how prepared we are, is there anything we can do to influence the outcome? This is the beautiful part of the serenity prayer, right? The serenity prayer, which I absolutely love, which I often find people are not good at because they underestimate what they can control and they're not willing to accept the things that are out of their control. And so part of what we want to look at for each one of those scenarios is what can we do to control the likelihood of this happening? What could we do to influence it, right? If we don't have full control, where do we have partial control? And which of them do we just have to witness and stand by because the outcome of what happens is out of our hands? And so what we start to get at in which for some people is a very kind of heady thought place thinker mode is we can begin to look at the landscape of what's possible. We can look at the likelihood of it's going to happen. We can look at how prepared we are for each of those. And then we can really look at in a very different way, what control, if any, do we have to influence the outcome? And part of what you see in companies right now is very active work to figure out how do we control our different product lines? How do we control our philanthropy? How do we control what we're putting out in the world? And so in that way, we're kind of able to see, and the desperate need that we all have for control is very obvious. And so what we're trying to do in that as the last phase of this work is that if we have that intelligence now inside of us, inside of our teams, inside of our families, of here's what could happen, here's the likelihood could happen, here's how prepared we are, what are the coming crossroads or decisions that I will have to make? What are the set of choices that land in front of me? And some of those choices I want to have clearly written down in the case that that unlikely scenario shows up, so I'm not meeting it for the first time. Some of those crossroads are decisions we would make now to invest in and see if we're prepared for those things to happen down the road. But in my own sense of safety, my own sense of preparedness and the work we're doing with lots of individuals and activists and companies, this allows them to be more with their feet on the ground and prepared, and also move out of this immediate crisis mode to think about what has to happen kind of moving forward. And that to me allows us in a very kind of, to me, feel good way, because I'm claiming and trying to find some place to be prepared. What do I have to do to prepare for each of these scenarios? If it happens, what choices do I have in front of me? And how would I lead and help people to be more active in helping them through this? There's a way in which I believe all of us are walking into scenarios that we're not fully prepared for, but we could equip ourselves better for. And so I would think about, in a few ways, the companies we're working with, in one sense, we're looking at these different scenarios on the biggest way. Again, we can get into more specifics in our small group in the Q&A afterwards. There's a very hopeful, optimistic COVID vaccine, right, that many people are looking at. There's actually different scenarios in the COVID waves of how it comes back into our own communities, the COVID waves that will move across this globe and how it affects communities and supply chains and people in different scenarios. Some of us are quick to forget that it's called COVID-19 because it's the version that showed up of that virus in 19 and don't want to even think about the idea that there could be a COVID-20. But again, part of this work, I hope for us, is living in realism and optimism, living in what could happen and how do we prepare ourselves for that, and living in optimism of what could be and what could we create. And there certainly is a short-term 3 to 6 month scenarios or set of scenarios where the COVID is the dominant frame. And there's no way to predict what life will look like afterwards, but we can believe there is a model and a set of time frame where COVID is not the dominant hierarchy or frame of which we're looking at everything. And how do we begin to anticipate those two worlds? And again, just honoring the fact that we are in a crisis and that we are in this place of trying to figure out this world. Part of what we want to begin to do is unlock those possibilities in an active way. Part of what happened before the COVID crisis is we were very normalized to the world that was. And in many ways, one of the skill sets we needed then that we need even more now is the skill set of imagination, of really understanding what is possible for us. imagination and that glory of dreaming and creativity and imagination of also what could be, so that we're prepared for it and we're not so surprised. And so part of what we're trying to do in the scenario planning, which again, I went through quickly, but tried to give you a frame to think about, is understand that we have and can be equipped in our businesses, in our communities, in our own families to prepare ourselves for those scenarios. Now, to say the obvious, it's very hard to be imaginative and planning in a crisis or inside of ourselves, right? It's hard to kind of land in that space. And so part of what we want to do now, like we did yesterday, is put you into small groups. We'll put you into rooms to talk about the application of these ideas. We'll do that for about 20 minutes. And again, just offer you to sort of say, how do these ideas or the scenarios you're in or looking at apply to you? We'll come back to do some ending notes, and then we'll spend the last half hour, again, just doing more deeper dive Q&A and story sharing for what's happening. So I hope that was productive and gives you a way to think about this. I'm going to test again my breakout room capacity to see if I can do that. Bear with me, I have many gifts. Technology is not one of them, but I am trying now. And I think I have it. So you will soon see rooms pop up. There will be a little thing to click on. It'll place you into a small group discussion to ask you to apply to these rooms. We see you moving to those rooms now. Again, introduce yourself. You should find, right, there should be a sign, right, a click to move into your rooms. There's about 33 of you who haven't yet moved into your rooms. Some of you may be away from your computer for a moment, but please invite you to click to those rooms. Rachel, can you help people move?
If you did miss the prompt, there should be a button on the bottom of your screen that says join breakout room. So go ahead and click that and you'll be automatically transferred into the breakout.
Rachel, looks like everyone is assigned a room.
Great.
Okay. I'm just going to get myself another drink and I'll come back in a moment.
We can sync. Great. Just a reminder to anybody that's still here, there's a button at the bottom of your screen that says join breakout room, and it'll automatically send you to the breakout where you've been assigned. If anyone has any issues, just let us know. anyone here is having problems joining the small group, just let us know and we'll get you in.
I just got kicked out. I don't know if anybody's on. I just got kicked out of my breakout room.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
You know which
I could-
room you were in?
Oh, and oh gosh, did it have a number or something?
Do you know another person's name who was in your group, and we can try and move you back?
First name was, one was Ann, one was N, Jeff. Oh gosh.
Yeah, there's a group with Ann Goddard and Jeff and Catherine or Chloe. Was that?
Yes, that's it.
I'm
That's
putting you
what I
back
got.
there now. Okay,
Okay,
here you go, Lisa.
Nice work. Lisa, you passed the pop quiz.
What's that?
You passed the pop quiz. You remembered the names of everyone in your group. Well done, you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Still not in there. Okay.
We're going to bring everybody back in a few moments. Here we come. Welcome back. Just waiting for people to return. They're starting to all come back now. We're going to do what we did yesterday and just ask for the moment for 3 reflections from the small groups. And then we'll do a little bit of closing and then invite anyone who wants to stay for the last half hour of Q&A. We're going to try something differently today and raise your hand. There's a little button next to you. I think if you manage participants to raise your hand. And we're going to try that device. But maybe we're just going to hear 3 reflections from your small group conversations. Who's willing to share a reflection or tell their story?
I can go. I don't know how to raise my hand. I just put like a thumbs up.
Good. Good to see you, Christine. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just have an overall reflection and listening to my small group, and I was really happy to meet them. I heard a lot of emotional words, and so everyone kept using a word. I heard the words fear, compassion, kindness, imaginative, transparency, vulnerability. And the idea that I thought was really striking was an idea with the virus, thinking about being fearful of connection, but also the way that we crave connection. But I would say consistent in all of what we were saying, there were a lot of emotional terms that came up.
Yeah, great, thank you. 2 other reflections from your small groups? Mike, do you want to share?
Sure. Let me just,
Mike.
okay, I'll keep a hand up there. Yeah, so for us, there was this kind of like simultaneous appreciation for futures that are more tenuous and that we had hopes and dreams for, put some capital against that may not materialize. And so there's some anxiety and sense of loss, impending loss. But then at the same time, on the other side, the sense of a collective appreciation and gratitude for the present, in that we're either with our families and loved ones, that we basically have our health together, that we have the resources to survive and probably even thrive, albeit under different conditions. And just navigating that polarity is maybe more stressful than I think any of us really appreciated.
Yeah. Just to say briefly, and then Kurt will come to you next. We're going to do a session next week on letting go, of how do we help us let go with some of this work. And then just, I think Mike and Christine, as you were both saying, if we anticipate the scenarios in front of us, which ones of those will all of those emotions and will all of that duality be present? And how do we prepare ourselves for that? Kurt, let's come to you, because it's always good to hear from you and to hear from a poet in times like this. And we want to give voice to artists, but also just want to hear where you are. Kurt, do you mind sharing?
Yeah, thanks, Zander. I hope I'm coming in okay. You may hear or see some background noise.
That's the best noise.
But yeah, we had a really great conversation, and what really stood out for me, Steve Lashansky was in our group, and he really he knew this methodology, and that for us in the moment of coming together. And
I think you went, Kurt, you got muted for a second.
Sorry. And so yeah, so having Steve there to facilitate us and provide some groundwork for us to build from was really important. So the power of facilitation in times like these really jumped to the surface, and even reflecting on, you know, morally leading us in a meditation, and the ways that we can find grounding, so that in these times of where it's easy to catastrophize, that that we have practices that can help us ground ourselves, and so that we can hold multiple perspectives at once. And so I was really grateful to Steve and grateful to the group, and that was one reflection I took away.
Great. Thank you, Kurt. And
Yeah.
we'll invite you to lead a meditation with us another day. Can you
I'll be grateful.
introduce your child to us before?
Yeah,
we
this
move on?
is Willow Grace. She's almost a year old at the end of April.
Great. Thank you. So
Thanks.
I just want to do one sort of framing piece, and then we're going to come back to more conversation, and Donald will come to your question or comment maybe next. But just as a quick reminder of some of what we've shared or our practices, part of what we're trying to do is these sessions every day. So we're going to continue for the rest of this week. There will be some sessions next week too. We're just getting into planning for that. But tomorrow is going to be about productive disequilibrium and how do we live through that, both ourselves and take others through that. We have some workshops and tools we can send more of. But also part of what I want to make sure before everyone gets off the line is that, because I believe we're going to go through an incredible need moment of mental health, that the crisis text hotline is one of the most immediate resources that people can have access to. And that we also want to point people to the Ladies of Hope Ministry, which is the group we're pointing people to today, committing every day to point us to where's there groups that have less safety net. And they're just an extraordinary organization that's working with women and formerly incarcerated women and trying to end the prison pandemic that's happening. And Topeka, Sam, who runs that, is a legend and a friend, but that's one place you can point some resources. So I just wanted to connect to those two things. We invite everyone to stay on for the next half hour to continue the Q&A, but realize that we're all kind of walking through so much at the moment. So thank you for everyone who's been there, but let's continue for the next half hour. Again, I think it is helpful to have you raise your hands, both because it's good to hear from you and see your face, and just ask for both the combination if there are questions, but also if they're just stories or things that you want to share. So Donald, I'll turn to you next.
Hi, thank you. This is amazing. Actually, I just raised my hand to talk about my group, so I'll just do that really quickly. There were a couple of things that came up. One person mentioned spend time figuring out what you can control the controllables. The other thing I love, somebody brought up the idea of a life map, which I thought was really terrific, especially with the idea, look back and try to figure out what are some of the things that you could let go of that you wanted to let go of anyway. And then as you use your imagination, thinking about what in the future might be created. So I thought that was great. And the last thing was somebody making the point that for some of us, we really are in the midst of trauma response. So we're in a hot zone. So thinking about what can we do to cool down, meditation, breathing, taking a walk, all of those things. So I love them all. I wrote them all down. So thank you for that.
Great. And again, Todd, I'll come to you for the next question in a moment, just to remind all of us, I think, Donald, what you were saying is this is a collective traumatic moment. And there are in the world now incredible resources of dealing with trauma. And so we will put some of those together and share those, but that it is traumatic and there are expertise in those areas. Second, to say that part of what we try to introduce is the scenario planning method as a way, just so you know it exists, so you can begin to practice it on your own, but there's a much more in-depth process that you can use. And then lastly, which I think we talked about a little bit yesterday, this process of looking back to look forward. I appreciate what you said, Donald, of looking back to what are the pieces that we want to let go of. And as we talked about yesterday, there's some pieces we want to let go of and kiss goodbye. There's other pieces that are really painful to let go of. And how do we honor the release of those things? But also, if we're going to look back, we might as well look back to our ancestors and our history and those who have been through difficulty. We might look back to what is the DNA that lives inside of us that was hard earned to get through whatever they got through? And what are the muscles and capacities that live in us that might be really necessary now? We have a whole Good Wolf process that brings people through that in a very disciplined way, but that would be really useful to sort of think about what's required moving forward, knowing how much of it exists in your ancestry and yourself that might be called upon now. So thank you for that, Donald. Todd Bennett, let's hear from you. Your hand is up. We'll come to you next. It's helpful to raise your hand. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks, Zander. And yeah, our group chat, my insights were that there's certainly this thinking about waves, and as it relates to the virus that confronts us now, that 18 months has been sort of a timeline where we might have a vaccine. And so how do we think about waves inside of that and how that might shape our decision making was an interesting reflection from one of the comments. The fact that this whole system is interconnected, and so then we thought, and there was another insight, was what doesn't serve us now, and that reflection of taking us forward and building a resilient self, and resilient businesses, and then resilient kind of communities. The third point was there was a deep sense of gratitude and how much we have, and the undocumented workers in the US was an example that was raised. And so why we're sort of considering scenarios, really to take time to be able to meet people where they're at. And I've experienced that personally over the last sort of 3 weeks, and just taking time to allow your scenario plans to figure out that there are a lot of people out there that we need to kind of support during this time. And so meeting people where they're at and offering that humility and empathy, and turning businesses that may have now blown up, which I've certainly had those, and being able to work with management teams on well, how can we put those assets of maybe the infrastructure and physical assets of hotels and the 3,500 employees, how can we kind of put that to good work at this time when there's a community and going to be so much need? So those are my insights. Thanks, Zander.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. And I just know you and all of us are sitting with some very difficult decisions of what do we do with those 3,000 employees or whoever we're taking care of. And I know that part of the scenario planning process can give us at times more options of how we're looking at that and what can work for whom. Obviously, we're doing this at a surface level, and I think your comments help us think at a much deeper level, because when we actually do the scenario work, underneath all of that are some very hard and beautiful questions of what are the values that are being exhibited in this scenario. This scenario is being designed for who? It's accountable for whom? It takes care of whom? And so obviously what we try to do today is begin to give you a platform to think about this and apply to business and those things. But you can imagine the nuance underneath those of who is this scenario giving and restoring power to, who is it protecting, who is it not protecting, and why we hope that if we have, in my experience, a very deliberate process, it actually can expand our creativity and our inclusiveness. If you ask people to design their scenarios in a crisis, they tend to be myopic and insular and actually not creative. They tend to be risk mitigating rather than generative. And so it does take an iterative process and some facilitation, which was what one of the other comments was from Kurt about facilitated process can expose those blind spots and expose what are the values and generativity inside the scenarios, rather than what sometimes feels like we're doing a scenario planning process, but we're just doing a self-protection process. And the question is, what we would ask is, if each of these happen, would we actually be safer for the long term? Or are we inviting what set of problems in with each of these? So it is a quite elastic process, but I appreciate both the decision set that you're sitting with, Todd, and helping us think about what are the values and the boundaries with which we're drawing those. So thank you for that. Kathy, let's come to you next. I see your hand. Let's hear your thoughts or comments or questions.
Thanks, Zander. They're somewhat related to the last couple of comments as well, but one was, I was very aware in our small group of the diversity. Actually, in one dimension, we were all women, so it was lacking in diversity, but in other respects, we come from very, very different work backgrounds, different parts of the world, different age demographics, all of those kinds of things. And sometimes those don't all come together and have common ground in a kind of work context, which is what I think this is, for me at least, is a work context. And so it's really expansive and wonderful to hear and to see and to feel connected to people who might not have as deep of a connection on a day-to-day basis. On the other hand, it's interesting, it raises for me that day-to-day when you work with people, you tend to know people, and you know people over time, and you sort of get to predict and anticipate what people are going to be like in various kinds of scenarios. But this is a scenario that's brand new for everybody and fairly significant and very quickly. And it raises for me the interesting thing that it uncovers things that you don't know about people that you work with day to day, and how to bring the process that you're talking about, the scenario planning, into a group setting where you think you know people, but in fact, something as dramatic as this uncovers very different parts of who they are and how they bring themselves into a crisis. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit from you about how the work that you do helps that process among people who think they know each other, but in reality may not, in fact, know each other under this level of crisis.
Yeah, great. Well, there's a lot in that question, and I appreciate you raising all of it. And I think the glory of that question is both that there are riches and there are concerns. Part of what we spend a lot of time thinking about is what are the decisions that are in front of people? What is the filter they're using to make those decisions? And then who is the decision maker? And so part of what I hear, what that raises in me is quite a set of questions of who's designing these scenarios and where are we coming together? I think you're absolutely right that this is revealing how little we've known each other, or what parts of ourselves have been able to access. I'm so disturbed by how many of our organizations are conditional constructs where we can enter that organization and share as long as we leave a whole bunch of ourself outside. And so part of what crisis could invite is ways for us to bring more of that and ourselves to this process. And that's our hope, but that's not often what happens. Some people are realizing this crisis, feeling under threat for the first time. Other people have felt that their whole life. And the stories and ideas that will come into a scenario planning process will be very different on those bases. And so trying to figure out where are we inclusive of those different data points. Trying to do a scenario process where everyone in your household is still healthy and is employed is different when you're the one person who's now employed and providing for everyone else. And those are the set of choices about how we sort of come together, which is why the scenario planning process sounds very benign and maybe how I laid it out, but underneath it is all of those kinds of realities. And we know that people cling to old models first, right? How much risk mitigation is happening? How much, unfortunately, of the broken system of the patriarchy do people still really want to have work? And so that's where, how do we create the spaciousness and the honesty within each other to have better outcomes is really where we're going to get to a generative answer. But I can't say that just holding the space for scenario planning will always generate that. But I think you're right to what does this invite in is really important. In some ways, safety and security will probably be some of the recipe for most of the scenarios moving forward. I was talking with my friend in sort of Van Jones last night, and we were talking about how what is the symbol of this current chapter? And he was talking about how the old symbol was the yoga mat, where you could be all you wanted to be and you could be deep and shallow and a consumer at the same time. And how we're in the moment now where the face mask is our kind of symbol of the moment. And it's sobering. It's sobering to think about how the scenarios that we're planning have to put in a baseline of security and safety that the last scenarios might not have had. But I think, Kathy, you're raising some really important questions of be conscious of what is the bias or the limitation of who we're inviting into that process. So I hope I answered or supported some of those notions from your question.
Yeah, very much. I feel like in many ways, it hits personally first, right? Everybody is doing scenario planning at the personal and family level. So it hits personally, then it hits family. And obviously for many of us simultaneously, it's hitting our business family as well. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would just amplify the good news. It's a skill set that we can get better at, and there's a set of practices and tools. We're leading people through that, but you can actually get much more sophisticated in what you're doing. Luis, let's come to you next.
Okay, can you hear me there? Yes.
Yeah.
So, Zander, thank you for putting this together. Nice to see you. As in our small group, I was discussing, and I got some ideas there as well, but how should we use this scenario planning for communication with the colleagues we work with? We're involved with a number of organizations. Personally, I feel the responsibility to communicate with the employees, the colleagues there, and give them some perspective of where things could be. You know, most people, if not all of the employees in these companies will not have access to someone like you or to this process of thinking in scenarios and planning around what could happen. No? So far, we have been able not to lay off anybody in the organizations, which is great. But there is no certainty that we will not have to do it in the next month, 2, 3, 6 months. We don't know. No? How do we frame communication to the employees in the companies in a way that they feel treated fairly, that we don't look overly optimistic because we cannot be, but at the same time give them tools for them to plan and to use these tools in a way that they feel a bit more certainty, because I'm pretty sure that all of them have a high level of uncertainty of where they will be in the next few months from now, because nobody knows really.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the question. A few things to say on that. One is just a very stark idea that there's a lot of employers who made the early decision not to let any employees go and made that explicit commitment. And that was a commitment that was done in a rush, in a small time frame. And almost 80% of the people I know who have made that commitment are starting to re-examine that. And just to anticipate that, which also helps us anticipate another wave of layoffs that may be coming. So just to have that thought process. And then I think your question about communication is important. Partially, we're trying to present these ideas in a way that they are approachable, that we can give them away. You don't need someone like me or some academic setting to hold them. So I think that's one thing we all want to figure out. I think a hard thing to say, or a different thing to say, is that I don't start from the place that transparency is a value. I think it's a tool. And so I don't think you should tell everybody every thought you've ever had. I think we want to be deliberate about how we're holding and supporting the other audience. That being said, there's an authenticity skill set that is so unparalleled at the moment that if you're not authentic, people are going to read you from a mile away. And telling them that there's only one scenario, people will know it's not true because they know it's not true in their bodies. And so one of the things you can do is say, look, we're looking and trying to prepare for these multiple scenarios. Let us, you don't have to even use the words, these different outcomes. Let us tell you what we're doing and prepare. Let us also tell you the values that are living in us as we look at those scenarios and our commitment to explore all of those values in each of those. And let me then share with you the decision process of how we're going to make them, or the timeline. Because I think it's false to tell them that you're going to promise them a narrow scenario when we don't have control of it. You can help them anticipate and foreshadow what those might be. You can tell them the values that you're using to weigh those. And then you can encourage them in their own lives to look at different scenarios. In the best cases, your scenarios would be a negotiation and a conversation. You'd want to know what are the realities of your employees. So many organizations have all of these, everyone is dealing with this in different ways, and we're not hearing back from your husband just got fired, you know, you're the only bread earner, what's happening with your children. Everyone's dealing with these realities, and in the best case, our scenarios are informed by the realities of others, but we can't and shouldn't make short, false-term promises. And part of the scenario lets us understand how to communicate that. So I think there is value in them knowing you're doing looking at different scenarios, how you're thinking about it, and the values behind. And then there will be hard days where a decision has to be made, and you'll have more value from that. the organizations that have had to make drastic cuts are kind of in two camps. One in which those cuts were understood by the people who were affected by those cuts, and those that were forced on them with an incomplete understanding. Not that one is right or the other, but you have a set of choices about how do you want to explain the scenarios or the decisions you made, and what is the value set behind them. And so I would begin to think about some of those communication patterns as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
It's a good framework there.
Yeah. Lisa, you have the next question.
Thank you. It's more a segue to what you've just said, which is, it feels to like something that came up yesterday about slow time, how time is the density of time and the rate of change has really changed. Since this quote unquote began, I don't even know where the beginning really was. And so one of the things that is stirring for me in your discussion about the scenarios is, in the past, we moved really, really fast. Fast was considered good and better and high achievement by many. And now we're being forced into slow time. And one thing that many of us lost was the capacity to verify what we heard. So we never really stopped and said, so I hear you saying. And it feels like a tool for for new scenarios is this capacity to verify what you hear from the other, and to be able to slow it down and be sure that there's some leveling, some connection and metabolizing collectively of what is being said. And it's a dance between hesitancy and being too presumptuous. And so I'd be curious what you're thinking about that. What are the tools that are out there, or the ones that are yet? I mean, this is where innovation would come, is the new tools that help us change this pattern, this kind of visceral pattern, to quickly jump, to quickly assume, and to quickly start creating scenarios without that kind of slow time.
Yeah. I'm not sure I fully understand the fast time, slow time frame. One of the ways I understand it, and at least I invite you to inform it or upgrade my thinking, is that we were in fast time, but fast time of activity and fast time of a lot of our default patterns, and not in fast time of change. And part of what we're being invited to now is to think about, what does fast time change mean? What does it mean to question and test and give up some of those activities that we got normalized to? And so I think you're completely right that we're at risk here of jumping again to our defaults, our default thinking, our default way of being. And our defaults, and as we're starting to see, were quite dangerous in some ways and are quite dangerous now. And so what you're talking about, in one way I understand it, is this very challenging way of how do we create pace? What is the pace with which we're willing to change? And just to do a little quite riff on pace, the first thing to say is that there's no glory in outpacing your people or outpacing reality. There's no glory also in underpacing that. And so part of what you're helping us think about is, how do you walk forward with the urgency you need to, while being informed by good data from other people, good data from the context, good data from your customers, your clients, whoever you're serving. That pace is critical. And so what helps me think about, or remind me of, is how are we supposed to figure out the pace? Because the pace will be dictated by a few different factors. The largest thing it'll be factored by is you, or each of us. It should also be dictated by our stakeholders, those people who we take care of or we report to, and like that, their pace, right? And what's interesting is that my pace and their pace might have nothing to do with the challenge we're actually facing, right? And so what I hear in your question, and trying to understand slow time and fast time, and really this wonderful question of what luxury do I have to be timeless, is a coordination between the challenge itself and the data of what it demands, the challenge of my stakeholders of what their needs are and what their pressures and expectations are, and of myself. And how do we locate ourselves in that without falling into our defaults and without going into our own bias and our old data sets? That's why I think the questions that were before of who are we doing this work with, what is the data we're taking in, who are we responding to, becomes very, very important. Because if we, out of need for control, out of need for comfort, recreate the old system, I can just hear COVID-20 whispering, I'm coming for you, you know? And this stuff is hard, and that's why we're trying to put ourselves in frameworks and tools that do that. So I hope, Lisa, that answered some of the frame or how to think about it. Kevin, let's come to your question next. We probably got time for one or two more in our time.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is beautiful serendipity for me. I'm glad that I've discovered your offering. The folks that were in my group, 3 out of the 4 of us are nominally self-employed, and it was interesting to hear the different perspectives. And one instance, a gal was saying, you know, I was going to pivot, and now I am pivoted. And another fellow had said, you know, had moved to Europe and Belgium with his wife who had a job, and he was going to be preparing himself for what he saw as opportunities there. And then there's myself, who's been an independent consultant for 15, 16 years, was going to get into the workforce, back into the workforce for, you know, for a number of reasons. And you know, this is catalyzing our decision making. It's catalyzing our, in ways that, you know, it's brought up something that, well, I've got to make the change now. I've got to make the shift now. It's even more urgent. And then correspondingly, another fellow who works for a company was talking about how they're already discussing the waves of things will emerge and then go away and then reemerge in terms of opportunity. And so there's great value in these conversations. Just serendipitously, I'm with this group of folks who have these different shared perspectives, but also responding already to what's in front of us. And so I'm seeing the value of this as being sharing these ideas and these information. I've come away today with a dozen ideas as to what to do next. And that's the beauty of it. I would offer one other thought, and I'll make this very brief, as I shared with them. A few weeks ago, I was becoming more and more depressed with what I was seeing and hearing and thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do? And then to your point of reaching back into my past, I worked with biotech companies and I had connections there. And I was following LinkedIn one day and I said, we've got a brain trust. What do we need to do to get people back to work? We need to guarantee that we have safety. And we need to assure that you know, you're safe and I'm safe, or I know that you are not safe yet, right? I mean, you're not past this, meaning you haven't contracted it and cleared the virus yet. And so there's an opportunity. If we can create something that can help people by testing rapidly, certifying their cleanliness and so on, or cleanliness, their certifying the fact that they're okay now, then you know, that's an opportunity. More like, you know, look, here's all these different ideas and they're all coming together at once, and that's the beauty and the power of this. With that, I'll stop.
Well, first of all, I'm glad this is helpful to you. I'm also aware that this last comment of how can we have a methodology that helps us feel more safe is what we're all looking for. And that's true for our organizations, it's true for consultants, it's true for our families. And there's a way in which we have this beautiful conversation that we haven't had of what would it take to feel more safe or be more safe, with a level of sophistication that we have never had before, or an openness to that. I hope that remains open for a while. And part of the scenario work is trying to anticipate what might be. And these are the moments where we're building the trusted space to do what's going to happen next. There's a way in which the people who show up now and how they show up are the people I'm going to remember for when I need them in the next phase. And so even if we're an independent contractor or a company, this is really where trust happens. There's a model with which trust is about, there's a period of harmony, there's a period of disharmony, there's a period of repair. There's a way in which most trust in my mind gets built in that period of repair, which of the scenarios that you're looking at are going to build that repair. That's the kind of space that I think we're looking at. And so I think we gotta have to close. I missed a question from Kevin and Karen. If you guys email me, I'll take them up and respond to you directly. Again, part of this space is for us to come together and to help us metabolize and be equipped for what's coming. We're doing, another one tomorrow on the productive disequilibrium and how do we thrive and move forward in that. But just thank all of you for coming together, sharing yourselves with each other and what you're doing. This is a time where we desperately have scenarios that are more inclusive, more collaborative, and just invite you to make sure that as you design who you're taking care of, you think expansively about that as this goes on. So thank you so much for the time. We'll see many of you tomorrow. Welcome feedback and thoughts from all of you. So thank you.
Thanks for the gift,
Thank
Zander.
you.
Thanks, thank you.
Thanks, Xander. Thanks, everybody.
Xander, thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zander. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Xander.
My pleasure. So
Thank
good
you,
to see
Zander. Much appreciated.
My pleasure. To be continued.
Thank you, Zander. That's great to see you.
Yes.
Good to see you. So lovely.
Thank you. Greetings.
Yes,
Thank you.
my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayim.
Hey, Jonathan. Good to see you, man.
Heck yeah, good to see you, brother.
All right. Let's get on the phone this week. I owe you a call, man.
I would really appreciate that, man, because you're awesome.
So are you. So are you. I have to go. I'm going to run because I have to go talk to the CEOs of the 50 largest development aid organizations.
Whoa.
So deep breath and continue, but so glad to see all of you. We'll see you
Have
soon.
a good day, Xander.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.